Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning to one of our panelists joining us from the US today. My name is Caroline Bjelland, and I'm a master's student at the University of Bergen and at the Christian Mickelson Institute. And I'm also a LawTransform volunteer. And I would like to warmly welcome you to this LawTransform seminar, which coincidentally also discusses my master's thesis subject or topic. So I'm really lucky. LawTransform, or the Center on Law and Social Transformations, is a center that aims to understand how rights and laws are being used as tools for social change. LawTransform is a collaboration between researchers and students at the University of Bergen and at the Christian Mickelson Institute, and has research affiliates in both US, India, Middle East, Europe, Africa, and Latin America, who all contribute to research and teaching. I encourage you to check out our webpage or follow us on Facebook and Instagram for more information about research and upcoming events. Please note that this event is being streamed, so everything said will be recorded. I also, to anyone's noticing, Lise and I are not wearing masks, but we're keeping a safe distance and following the guidelines of Bergen County. In this seminar today, we will be discussing the political consequence of religion or religious institutions on the African continent, with a special focus on Pentecostalism, a growing religious branch within Christianity. And for our Norwegian listeners, Pentecostalism refers to pinsebevegelsen. As I am no expert on this subject as of yet, I am lucky enough to be joined by people who are. Today we have with us Professor Paul Gifford, who is an emeritus professor at the at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Gifford has published numerous of books and journal articles, including Christianity, Politics, and Public Life in Kenya, and Ghana's New Christianity, Pentecostalism in a Globalizing African Economy. I also have with me today Professor Elizabeth Sperber, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Denver. She specializes in comparative politics with a regional expertise on sub-Saharan Africa. And she has also written the award-winning journal article, Pentecostal Identity and Citizen Engagement in Sub-Saharan Africa, New Evidence from Zambia, which she co-authored with Aaron Hearn. And also with me today, I have Lise Rakner, who is a professor of comparative politics at the University of Bergen and a political scientist focusing on democratization with a special focus on Eastern and Southern Africa. She's also one of the project leaders of the Breaking Bad project, Understanding Backlash Against Democracy, a LawTransform affiliate, and my supervisor. Welcome, everybody. So yes, just so you know that the audience can also ask questions at the end of this seminar. So just put in whatever you're wondering. So we're discussing the role of the Pentecostal church in democratic backlash in sub-Saharan Africa. So first of all, I think we need to understand what democratic backsliding is and how is it evident in sub-Saharan Africa, Lisa?
So thank you, Caroline, and thank you for inviting me to this super exciting panel. So I think backsliding is a little, it's a little bit of a difficult word. So I would like to use the word autocratization.
Okay.
But we're talking about the same thing. But the reason why I would like to use that word is that this sort of chipping away of rights and of human rights, of legal rights, of right to freedom of association, gender rights, and so forth. It happens not only in democratic regimes, it also happens in autocratic regimes. So autocratic regimes become more autocratic, and then democratic regimes become less democratic. Yeah. So in a sense, autocratization covers it all. What is interesting about this wave of autocratization compared to earlier times of, when we've seen attacks on democratic rights is that it's contrary to military takeovers, coups, and so forth. This is happening very piecemeal and it's very gradual. That means that it's also very difficult to pinpoint exactly when a regime goes from being a democratic to being something else, because it's a kind of a gradual chipping away of rights, one right by one right, in a sense. And it is also, and it's not all rights that are under attack. It's basically it's very much sort of liberal rights, right to freedom of expression, right to organization, gender rights. And so there are particular types of rights that are under attack. And also it happens via the use of law. That's another very sort of significant part of this process. So in a sense, by changing these things via law, you legitimize the changes. And we can go from anywhere in Africa, Poland, Hungary, the US. There are just so many places where this, we see these familiar traits. Small changes in the legal system, changes in how you appoint judges. These all small piecemeal changes. And at the end of the day, there is a big change, but it's exactly when democracy died or when autocracy took over. It's very hard to pinpoint, which is also making it hard to study, and not least hard to protest. Because when do you go out in the streets? When do you know that enough is enough? And I think this is some of the real problems we have, and why, of course, studying this is so exciting, but it's also very complicated. And so another way that I could have responded to your question was to say, Caroline, there is no backlash or there is no backsliding. Because if you look at cross-national data for sub-Saharan, for Africa in general, whether you look at the sort of variety of democracy data of Freedom House, in fact, in terms of Africa, you see more of a flat line than a backlash. And that has to do with these changes being so piecemeal and actually being really hard to capture in cross-national data, which is one of the reasons why we really have to go in and study this in more detail.
Yeah, thank you so much. And also, I have a question for our Professor Gifford here as well, because I think we also need to understand, what is Pentecostalism? Who are Pentecostals?
Well, again, thank you, Caroline, for inviting me. I'm very pleased, very happy. There's a big variety in Pentecostal churches, but I don't think I'm doing it any injustice to describe it through its worship. Also, I'm talking about African Pentecostalism, and I think sometimes dragging in examples from the United States or Europe complicates things unnecessarily. But so I would say it's characterized most of all by its exuberant, expressive, participatory worship. And that's the big characteristic. A service on a Sunday could last a couple of hours, or at least 2 hours. And the first half really will be singing of great participation, a lot of expression. And in the bigger ones, big choirs, and the music can actually be quite spectacular, and which I think is one of the appeals. Then there'll be testimonies. Most churches will have people coming up to explain what God has done for them in the last week or so. And that's important, and it does give an idea of the sort of Christianity it stands for. Then there's a sermon which could go on for about an hour. It would claim to be biblical. I mean, we can discuss that, but the sermon is really, I suppose, the other half. Then there'd be an offering, which is also quite important when there'll be more singing. So that characterizes the churches, and most of them have evening events as well. Most of them are heavily involved in the media. Normally the pastor's sermons, and with the deregulation of broadcasting systems in Africa over recent years, this Christian input has become more and more important, more significant, and it's nearly all of this, what I would call Pentecostal character. Does that explain what?
Yes, thank you. Do you have anything to add, Professor Sperber?
No, I think that's a great explanation. From a more kind of textbook perspective, we might also add just that, there's this emphasis on the Holy Spirit that isn't as conventional in, say, the Catholic Church or some other denominations, and this idea of, people expressing, in this expressive worship that Paul was describing so well, the idea is that those expressions are manifestations of the Holy Spirit, or charisms, right? That are manifested in terms of healing or speaking in tongues, or prophecy, a sort of variety of these ways that people experience the Spirit sort of within them.
Yeah, thank you. And also, I guess from studying this, you kind of realize that religion and politics go hand in hand in many African countries. What would you say is how is the Pentecostal church different in its political role from more mainline churches like the Catholic or the Protestant church, would you say?
Well, this is a great question. It's one I'm interested in continuing to try to answer, and have already learned a lot from Paul's work and others, and very excited about the ongoing work that folks are doing in Bergen as well. So thank you. I should have started off by saying thank you for having me. Yeah, I think, this varies a lot by country and over time, potentially, especially when we think about the role of some of the older churches, so the Catholic or mainline Protestant churches. A major kind of trend, a landmark trend in this, history is the transition to democracy, or maybe we'll put democracy in air quotes, but the transition away from Cold War era autocracies towards multi-partyism and liberalization in the early 90s. The mainline churches, Catholic and mainline Protestant churches, played significant roles in facilitating those transitions in many, not all, African countries, and this wasn't only in Africa either, but in some countries, evangelical and what was then a much smaller population of emergent sort of budding Pentecostal churches, may have been involved. Zambia, the Evangelical Fellowship, was kind of a part of that movement, although much smaller and much less of a leading role. But the way that churches and politics have engaged since the early 90s, when there was this, again, trend, not exactly the same everywhere, but trend for the churches to be engaged in pro-democracy mobilization and critiquing authoritarian regimes, is that in some countries, as Pentecostalism has grown, some of its leading voices, at least, leaders of Pentecostal churches, so not necessarily all of the worshipers, but they have, in many cases been associated with justification for anti-democratic actions or policies, everything, ranging from questions of human rights and issues around LGBTQ, issues, to more direct questions about constitutional amendments and, policies that are sort of more related to formal politics. And so there is this kind of question that people like us are thinking about, which is, what is the role of the incredible demographic change that we've witnessed and continue to witness on the continent when it comes to the growth of Pentecostalism? How does that affect the, historically kind of more pro-democratic role of some of the older churches, with this kind of new actor on the scene who, at least in, sometimes in places, has been markedly kind of associated with less democratic changes.
Yeah, thank you. And Professor Gifford, you have called Pentecostalism an enchanted religion. What do you mean by that? And does it have any political consequence that they are or public effects?
Enchanted, it's a reference to Max Weber's idea of that in the West we've become disenchanted, that normally we would think in terms of functional rationality. And by and large, the idea that spirits are causing everything, that has receded right to the periphery. In fact, many would deny that these spirits exist. But I think this is where these Pentecostal churches really hit the spot, because that's exactly what they do cater for. That idea, the traditional religion, that spirits are everywhere, nothing is purely matter. Spirits are everywhere, spirits are influencing each other. These are spirits of hills, lakes, forests, and then ancestors, of course, can influence us. So I think in African traditional religion, that would have been the primary realm of causality. Things happen because the spirits brought them about. Now, the mainline churches, and Elizabeth was saying, are different in that by and large, they don't deal with that at all. In fact, they never have. They probably won't deny the existence of these spirits, but really they would regard that as superstition, paganism. Whereas these new churches, to me, that's one of their biggest characteristics. They actually talk about this quite openly on a Sunday. And in the past, say a Lutheran would go to church on a Sunday and then during the weekday maybe would slink off to see a healer diviner to have their religious needs met. Well, now you don't have to do that. You can have it done on a Sunday. So the spirits of bankruptcy, the spirit of divorce causing things, the spirit of childlessness, these things can actually be dealt with in these churches. So I would, it's not just me, but this idea of the enchanted imagination kicking in this Christianity, which is not the case with the mainline churches.
No, do you think
that's the reason, the biggest single reason for their success?
Yeah. And do you think it kind of diverts attention away from political life because the political landscape is not something that causes your economic situation? It is because of spirits, or?
I would agree. That is the danger. It's not that they're anti being democratic, but basically if all your concentration or the major part of your concentration is on the spiritual forces responsible for something, it does take your mind off corruption, economic situation, the trade flows, the currency, all this sort of thing. And some actually will preach that. Some of the big famous ones will actually preach that your economic situation has nothing to do with the situation in the country. It's got everything to do with the spirits that you have to cast out by prayer and fasting, and also through the ministration of the Pentecostal leaders.
Great, thank you. So I think you kind of touched upon it, that Professor Sperber, but you mentioned something about how they kind of touch upon the LGBTQ community, for example. And I was just wondering how you would say that the Pentecostal church have kind of changed the moral discourse, have they? And especially with focusing on civil liberties, such as the LGBTQ community and others. Are the leaders actively trying to kind of crush these liberties, or?
Yeah, it's a really big and important question, and it's points to a lot of really complicated sub questions. I think for folks who are interested in LGBTQ politics on the continent and the relationship to Christianity in particular, Adrienne Van Klinken and Chitando have really good work on this. That's more particular to cases. Also, Bampani and Valois have an edited volume from a few years ago called Christian Citizens, and again, kind of dives into some of the more country level details related to this question. So I would encourage people to check out those works. It's easy to sort of feel anxious about Pentecostalism and politics because it is very new, and as Paul points out, it is very enchanted in this way that especially Western scholars, but a lot of folks in sub-Saharan Africa and the mainline churches sort of aren't used to or necessarily comfortable with. I think it's important, just before addressing the rates question, to say though that there is some there's some reason for optimism about the ways that Pentecostalism, or really born again Christianity in general, which would include the charismatic movements like within the Catholic and mainline churches now, which have kind of come about as they attempt to stem the tide of loss of members to the Pentecostal churches, right? Kind of a negotiated situation. But for folks who are in these charismatic and Pentecostal worlds, the idea that, as Paul was saying, the spirits, really, God and the Holy Spirit especially kind of help shape what happens in the world, and that if your faith is strong enough and you're devout enough, that God will support you in achieving what you want to achieve in the world. This can manifest in a lot of different ways, but Gwyneth McClendon and Rachel Riedel have a recent book out where they explore how there are sort of benefits of this when it comes to feeling self-efficacy that can translate into the realm of formal politics. Feeling that you're supported by God and your strong faith will support you can lead people to be more proactive. At the same time, it can lead them to think that change is possible in the world in a way that, in their research in Kenya, they suggest members of the mainline churches, mainline Protestantism and Catholicism, sometimes, by contrast, feel sort of disempowered by the hierarchical and somewhat, I don't want to say negative, but maybe more sort of realistic attempt to think about how change happens in the world and the need for sacrifice and valuing the poor and this kind of stuff that differs across these churches. So I just wanted to say that it's there's debate and lots of room for study about these specific issues. In terms of rights, very complicated. There's certainly, as Paul was saying, Pentecostal leaders stand out in part for their strong media presence a lot of the time. And so in cases like Uganda and some others, the Pentecostal voices on the question of LGBTQ rights, for instance, have been, maybe among the loudest when kind of condemning LGBTQ issues and warning against them as unchristian. But I think it's also important to note that it's, unlike in the US where the sort of religious right is in some ways, kind of the only voice that was really loudly anti-LGBTQ. That's not the case in many African countries. And there is a sense, in many situations that also a kind of African traditionalism, would prohibit against LGBTQ rights. And it's just very, very complicated. So, it's certainly one of the loud Pentecostal leaders have certainly been among the loud voices in some of the most kind of condemnatory rhetoric and push for most kind of prohibitive legislation. And that's really important to try to understand, but they're not the only ones. So I think it's a little bit of a watch this space and keep trying to unpack it situation.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. And also you, Professor Paul Gifford, you have argued that these churches are not political actors, they are religious bodies, but that doesn't mean that they don't have public effects. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yes, well, when these churches first really broke onto the scene, it was mainly in Latin America where they were noticed. And because it was so obvious that they were almost the opposition to liberation theology, which was concerned with the structures and changing societies and politics. These ones, by contrast, did not do that. Therefore, some thought, well, the whole thing is funded by the CIA, funded by the American security services to make the world safe for capitalism, that sort of thing. And I mean, I don't think that was ever really in play in Africa, maybe in Southern Africa, at the end of apartheid, but beyond that, I wouldn't think so. So that's basically what I meant. That as I explained, that I think the appeal of these churches, it's not the political side. It's because I can go and get my religious, spiritual needs met. I can go and find out why which spirit is causing my daughter's malaria, which spirit is causing the bankruptcy of my business, this sort of thing. So I don't think there's anything suspicious in it at all. But the public role is it's on different levels, I think. I mean, there's been quite a bit of study, mainly in Latin America, but on, say, it's not the position of women. Lise mentioned the gender rights and so on. It's not Western feminism, but many have pointed out that if you can actually get the males converted so that at night, instead of going out drinking with the little money that they've got, that they're actually at home with the wife and the children and reading the children's stories before they go to bed and so on. This is actually having a big effect, not straight on the political field, but on the cultural field. So, to pick up on something Elizabeth said, the things can be changed. This is their big message. I think the sermon, it's about success and victory and achievement. Now, the issues come up, I think, when in what particular way can Pentecostalism bring about success? Well, some say motivation. That's true. Motivation, giving them skills, say even just to stop drinking and womanizing, go home and to take up your responsibilities. And in some churches, especially the Winners' Chapel, at some stage in the service, you have to turn to your neighbor and say, have you started your own business yet?
Yeah.
So this, encouraging entrepreneurship. So there are many good points of these churches, but I do think things get complicated when then also means of being successful are the faith gospel. You just believe and it will happen. Then through the spirits, if everything is focused on the spirits, if you can get rid of the spirits that are responsible, you will be successful. I don't think that is tremendously conducive to taking part in politics. And now I think more and more that, well, the tendency is that these pastors of these churches are becoming so powerful, all the stress is on their particular gifts. And so Lise mentioned autocratization. I think that that's a very good word, because these churches, the tendency is for them to embody that totally. These people are becoming totally autocratic and nobody can challenge them because they're the agents of God, and to actually go against them is to challenge God. And there are many of these pastors probably won't say it explicitly, but they can kill people if you go against them. I mean, it's very dangerous to go against them. So I think this autocratization that Lise mentioned, that is a key point about their public role.
Yes. Yeah. So, so it's a, just that it's actually kind of a question to both of you, if you allow me.
Yeah.
Because what I think what you're saying now touches about the role of the pastors and kind of internal affairs in the church. And so I would really like to challenge both of you, if I may, to sort of your thoughts about how this sort of spills into society. Because in one sense, you could think from what you're saying about this individualization and this focus on my wealth and my success, you could maybe say that these churches are taking on less of a political role, so they're becoming apolitical. But I would be interested in just kind of pressing you to describing this autocratization within the church. How do you see that as potentially spilling over into societal relations?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in here. So I appreciate that, and this is such an important, fun conversation. I think the term autocratization within the church is something we should be. It's sort of a delicate term. I think it's worth pointing out that structurally, the Catholic Church, for instance, is intensely hierarchical. There are no women, priests, and you have to study for years and years to, move from altar boy to, whatever, move up the chain of sort of leadership, right? And so, there are arguments that in structural terms, there's sort of less room for popular engagement and a more sort of democratic ethos. in some of the older churches, which ironically, are associated with, I shouldn't say ironically, perhaps ironically, are associated with mobilization for democracy in the public sphere in many African countries. But the sort of internal affairs, as you point out, may look a little bit different. And the Pentecostal church, may be a bit of the opposite, in the sense that within the church, as Paul was describing, we have big, co-ed, multi-gendered, choirs, and we have people coming up and giving testimony, and using their bodies and experiencing the Spirit internally, as an individual, but also as a member of this, very devout body, their new family, right? You're sort of born again into the family of your church. And so it's really complicated. There's a real ambivalence there. And Naomi Haynes, the anthropologist, as well as Kama Kaunda, a Pentecostal pastor and theologian, they've both sort of written about some of this ambivalence and some of the challenge of, some potential for seeing a kind of almost democratization going on within the community of Pentecostals, although with limits. And then the role that we see the leaders playing kind of more publicly in terms of legitimizing autocratization or actions that are contra kind of liberal democratic norms. So it is, I hate to sort of not give a straight answer, but it is really complicated. And I think one thing, just I'll add briefly and then transfer to Paul, but from a political science perspective, the structure of the church matters. So the fact that it's not, there's not such a hierarchical organization of, say, all the Pentecostal churches in one country, right? It's sort of each big church for themselves competing in a marketplace kind of idea. And the fact that they don't have huge transnational networks like the Catholic Church, for instance, or the World Council of Churches to help support development programs and this and that. Even the large, powerful Pentecostal churches may be more structurally dependent on the favors of local elites, sort of national elites in their countries. And as we know, political elites control a lot of resources and status in many countries, especially sub-Saharan countries. And so there may be this kind of structural incentive to placate or engage with and really focus on the behavior of elites in this way that is distinct from sort of how the Catholics and Protestants have traditionally thought about engaging with political leaders and parties.
Thank you. Professor
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I think I'd agree with a lot of all that. And I'd just like to point out that many different things can be going on at the same time. That Elizabeth's quite right, that some of these churches provide jobs for people, sort of as a status recognition that they'd never have before. A peasant woman from up country comes to town and all of a sudden she's an usher. It's the first job she's ever had. So there is all that side to it. But I do think that, many of these, I don't think I'm maligning them to say that the status of a pastor, they started off as brothers and sisters. Then they became bishops, then archbishops, and now in Ghana there are mega bishops. So this idea that I think that autocratization is very characteristic. However, I don't want to imply that that's the only force operating on people. People go to these churches. I think it's a big mistake to say that all these people are born again, their lives are changed, every single one becomes a new person. I think that can be the implication that some give. But many people, if you're a poor young woman living in a slum area, 4 to a room, just to have somewhere to go on a Sunday and dress up for, that's important. And the music, it can be magnificent. It's the equivalent of a rock concert in many cases. So all these things are going on. But I do think the autocratization in the churches is a significant characteristic. I don't want to make it absolute, but generalizing, I think that is important. What effect it has outside, well, I'd say at the very least, it doesn't encourage people to challenge autocrats. So I'll leave it at that. There could be other pressures on a person that would, because of his job, because of trade, because of his business, he might be led to challenge autocrats, but the church itself would not be doing that. I accept also the point that Elizabeth made that the mainline churches can be tremendously hierarchical and so on. But nevertheless, I do think that, say, the Catholic Church, Elizabeth mentioned, in many cases, they're prodded by overseas. You've got to sort of speak up. Before an election, the Catholic bishops will get together and issue a pastoral letter telling people to get out there and vote and pointing out the deficiencies. So it's a contribution on another level. But that is one thing that the Pentecostal churches, because they do tend to be personalized and without the international bodies prodding them, they're not so renowned for that.
Thank you so much. And on that note, I was going to touch about you, Elizabeth. To what extent do you think the Pentecostal church has affected voting behavior? And especially Zambia, that's the country of your research. What were your founds there?
Yeah, so just briefly, I really agree with what Paul said, and I think it's a helpful way to think about this question, sort of the one you're asking, as well as the broader question about sort of public implications, in that Pentecostal churches do not encourage people to sort of go out and fight for democratization in the ways we're used to thinking about it, at least. However, as Paul is saying, many things going on at once, this idea of the kind of individual level, empowerment and increase in self-efficacy that, may come from participating in Pentecostal churches or hearing Pentecostal sermon messages, as McLennan and Riedel show, this can affect behavior in ways that are consistent with kind of democratic participation at the same time. So we saw in our study in Zambia with Aaron Hearn and I, using original survey data, that Pentecostals tended to be more politically interested in terms of their expression of, following the news or caring about politics. They tended to be more politically engaged and report, voting at higher levels or having a party affiliation at a higher level than their, Catholic and sort of Protestant peers and others. This is sort of a less consistent or strong finding, but there's some evidence that Pentecostals are actually more likely to say, in survey questions when asked if they support democracy or if they would tolerate a strongman leader, that actually they're often a bit more likely than, say, their Catholic peers to say no. They kind of insist on democracy, which is interesting given everything we've talked about, and we find that in the Pew survey of over a dozen African countries, they were also less likely to say they would prefer a strong leader during difficult times, meaning a more autocratic leader. These are not always statistically significant findings or huge findings, but they're perhaps contrary to what we might expect. And I think I would love to just briefly contextualize that or put some kind of scope conditions on that, which is to say, Pentecostal churches are relatively new. Many of the members of Pentecostal churches have opted into them as thinking adults or late teens, right? As opposed to the Catholic Church, where you might be born into and baptized as an infant and just identify as Catholic later in life, but you haven't necessarily made a conscious investment in deciding that it will be part of your identity and your active itinerary in life to really engage in the Catholic Church if you say you're Catholic on a survey, right? Whereas with Pentecostals, it's more often than not, you find that someone who says they're Pentecostal is really an actively engaged church member. And so there's this caveat in terms of understanding, what work is the Pentecostal church itself doing, or the Pentecostal faith doing, as opposed to, is there a selection effect where people who are more, have more self-efficacy and have a desire to act, may be drawn to these churches and leave, the older, more hierarchical churches, where they, can't become an usher in a week or whatever, because they want to be leaders. And this is something that I heard time and time again in focus groups in Zambia, and interviews over the last 10 years almost, that especially youth, especially as Paul mentioned, folks kind of struggling economically, finding opportunities for status and employment and just action is really appealing. And so we do see some correlation with more political engagement among Pentecostals, but I think we shouldn't necessarily infer that means that it's the doing of the Pentecostal leaders, mobilization tactics, like Paul said, it's not because of pastoral letters, right? And it may not even necessarily align with the kind of faith message itself.
Thank you. Do you have a comment on that, Paul?
No, I think Elizabeth's findings are very helpful. I haven't been to Zambia for 20 years, but last time I was there under Chiluba, I think he illustrates another thing. These churches are now becoming so significant, they're so big, that political leaders can no longer afford to ignore them. By and large, political leaders have not gone out of their way to alienate the mainline Protestants and the Catholics, and that even give them duty-free rights to bring in cars and medicines and so on for their hospitals. Now, now these newer churches have sprung up. The churches, they also are putting in for duty-free rights and this sort of thing. And I'm sure Chiluba, back then in Zambia 20 years ago, he played on that to a great extent, giving them recognition. And of course, many of these people that I regard as rather thuggish rulers, like Moi in Kenya and so on, he would be in the front row of every Pentecostal crusade that came to show that he was a born-again Christian, devout. Therefore, he deserved the votes of all these people. I don't know, there's been not much work done on the extent to which that succeeded, but it is a factor that not just Moi, but Momo in Sierra Leone, Kirikou in Benin actually was a Marxist. But when these churches really sprung up, there's no mileage any longer in being a Marxist, so he changed his name to Matthew and became a born-again Christian, just to get these votes. So that is another aspect that needs, and also Elizabeth would know more about this than I would, but some of these people have such crowds and such pulling power that they actually think will branch out into the political sphere. Like Neves Mumba actually stood for president in Zambia. He didn't get anywhere, and by and large, this hasn't really worked much, very successfully. But that is another factor. These churches are now so high profile that governments have to cater for them if they want to stay in power.
So they're kind of used as political tools for politicians, in a way.
What's that?
So they're used as like a platform to advance your political stance, in a way.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. So I just have also a question to both of you. To what extent do you think that the Pentecostal church has shaped politics in sub-Saharan Africa in different countries, or has it even?
I would love to jump in and sort of maybe tie this back to the last question. So this question of sort of cause and effect is really, again, really complicated. And I think that, a lot of the things that Paul is saying are absolutely, true and right. At the same time, in my dissertation now book project, I've really been exploring the question of to what extent do changes in the political structure, so transitions to multi-partyism, for instance, and even among multi-party states, places and times when it's more politically competitive, when, for instance, an incumbent has less popularity and may have more of a struggle to win re-election. How does this track with the growth and sort of prominence or access to resources of Pentecostal churches? And there are multiple sort of forms of imperfect evidence that suggest that this phenomena of what I call politicized propagation is part of the story, in the sense that, exactly as Paul was saying, as these churches began to sort of build up and become popular in the late 80s and early 90s in many cases, politicians saw the potential of trying to cultivate constituencies through those churches. And at the same time, what I find is that in places where the Catholic Church and or the mainline Protestant churches were mobilizing, more forcefully to sort of hold those incumbent leaders to account, or to push for more democratic constitutional measures, et cetera, that these are the times and places we actually see incumbent, ruling parties engage more openly, invest more openly, like Chile was slush fund, to sort of allocate more status in various forms, including TV station access that they granted Pentecostals but denied Catholics at the same time in Zambia in the 90s, the early 2000s. That there are many sort of ways in which the parties themselves can contribute to the growth and sort of foster the growth and prominence of Pentecostal churches. And I think this is partly about trying to cultivate constituencies to have, a meaning and a platform and a claim to sort of shared moral values or whatever, the same way we see in the US. But I think it's partly about trying to compete with and undermine these other organizations, which, especially in states with civil societies that are not, able to withstand really tough economic and political periods, the older churches tend to be the last folks standing in terms of big international organizations that can really call out and hold leaders to account at the local level, even in rural areas, right? Places where NGOs aren't well rooted. There are older churches that are, and so I think this dynamic of from the political perspective, from the perspective of incumbent leaders in particular, the utility of Pentecostals as competitors for some of these other institutions is something that is really interesting, and that there is some evidence to suggest that that's part of what's going on.
Yeah, thank you. And I think now we have to start with questions, if I'm not mistaken. We have one question for you, Paul, and it says, on Gifford's comment, the appeal of churches is personal, not political. Is there not differentiation between the appeal to general members versus the appeal to politicians who support and mobilize them, politicians who might care more about the church's political stances?
Yes, that's a good point, to just differentiate between the ordinary person who goes along and then the important people who might actually be in the political sphere. There is a distinction to be made, and but to me, a point we haven't made that I think is worth making is that the kind of Christianity that is illustrated by these churches, the Catholic Church, the Lutherans, the World Council of Churches do have a political theology. I think up till relatively recently anyway, these churches cannot be said to have that. So I think they are more easily co-opted. And I do that point Elizabeth just made about the last people standing, as autocratization, Lisa's term, tends, even here in Ethiopia today, NGOs are really being throttled. But you'd have to be a very brave president to actually throttle the mainline churches. They're too powerful. They've been around so long. They've got international connections. So they're quite hard to throttle. These newer churches, probably because they are so individualistic, are more easy to pick off one by one. I'm sorry, I haven't really answered the question, but I hope that suffices, yes.
Yes, thank you so much. And we have the next question for you, Lisa, I think. Lisa spoke about one of the main difficulties regarding autocratization in sub-Saharan Africa is that the process is generally slow and creeping, and so it's hard to identify a moment for protest. The panelists have discussed the potential and difficulties with regard to the possibility of Pentecostal churches cultivating democratic citizens, but in view of the process Lisa described, I wonder if the main problem is not much how much a citizen value democracy, but whether citizens can be coordinated to oppose autocratic laws. Could be a more centralized autocratic religious institution be better positioned to do this? I guess this was for the panelists. I'm sorry.
I think that would be that's a brilliant question.
Yeah.
I would like to reflect on, but I would very much like to hear your views on that. So I'll chip in at the end.
Yes.
Yeah, Paul, do you want to speak to this? It's sort of in line with what you were just saying, I think.
It's an excellent question, by the way.
Well, I think that the point that you brought up, Elizabeth, that idea of throttling NGOs, that's a good example, I think, of autocratization. But it's very hard to take on the mainline churches like that. As even Banda in Malawi found, he was trying to silence the Catholic bishops. Immediately, the European bishops got onto the European Union that if anything happened to those Catholic bishops, Europe would cut off all aid. So that sort of thing is an instrument the mainline churches can operate, but so far, those instruments are not available to these individualistic, personalized churches, no matter how big they are.
Yeah, I mean, Kate's own work on churches in Africa is also amazing and interesting and more historically engaged with than what we've talked about here today. But yeah, I absolutely agree. I think this question about sort of the mobilizing potential, and Paul talked earlier about the mechanism of the pastoral letter, which is essentially when especially typically the mainline older churches, Catholic and mainline Protestant churches, often in unison, will issue letters in which they don't mince words, condemning corruption, condemning autocratic laws that are proposed, condemning crackdowns on civil society, and importantly, encouraging people to come out and vote. Those are read in every church across the nation, and all of these member churches on Sunday mornings with the full moral force of the local religious authorities. And we've seen historically, especially again in the early 90s, but in different sort of moments in different countries since then, that they can be extremely effective coordinating devices, and also kind of morally morally rich ways of mobilizing people. And we haven't, seen this, I think, certainly partly because of the lack of organization and coordination among Pentecostal churches in sub-Saharan Africa. The one exception might be Nigeria, where the CAN, the Christian Association of Nigeria, I believe, has more buy-in sort of across the Christian sphere. So you have more engagement with even the Catholic Church and some of the other Protestant churches and Pentecostal churches, and they, Nigeria is sometimes an interesting exception to some of these rules. They've been more engaged in trying to run their own politicians, or to support born again politicians, or very explicitly Christian politicians. And there's sort of a different set of incentives, I think, because of the intense sense of competition with Islam, especially in the last 10 years, with more explicit sort of political issues around Islam in the public sphere as well. And so there you see the emergence of this broader, more hierarchical organization that does try to sort of mobilize across churches, but not necessarily for the purposes of protesting autocratic leaders, so much as trying to promote leaders that they view will sort of be more appropriate and support Christian ideals and projects.
Yeah, I think
I would. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
You go first.
No, I just wanted to to emphasize again that I think there is a real difference in the theologies of these churches. The mainline churches have, over the last few decades, become much more involved in democratization, development, participation. The Pentecostal churches, at least so far in my experience, their theology is more personalized. It is about success, changing your life, but it's my family, my wife, my children, my job, my success, my promotion, my visa to Norway. So it's that personalized, and I think that is a point worth making. But I'd love to hear Lisa's comment on anything we've said today. Because she's the expert in autocratization.
So thank you for putting me on the spot. And I mean, I've so thoroughly enjoyed listening to you, because I mean, you are the expert on the church or the churches. But what I find so fascinating with this discussion, back, to sort of come back to the question, is that we talk about the the sort of mainline churches as having a political role, and we also know quite a lot about their international linkages and their international connections. In terms of the Pentecostal churches, I think one of the things that we haven't touched upon is their international linkages, and to what extent they are. What are the international forces that they are linked to, and are they democratizing or autocratizing? The Uganda example is a pretty glaring one, in terms of the pastors that were too radical for Texas and that sent their propaganda to Uganda. So one bit of research that I think what I need to know more about is the differences in the international linkages. So I think that's an issue that we would maybe get us to this question. And then I'm also thinking back to the question, so if these churches are more individualized and not being in such just kind of national and international hierarchical structure, does that give them a more democratizing force? I think in a way that's a super interesting question, but I think so. One, I want to know much more about how the various Pentecostal churches are linked international and to whom. And then I think the other really important question that I need to know more about is who they are linked to domestically. What is the links to politics? What political movements are the Pentecostal churches linked to? Do they always link in up to the incumbent party? Do they so are the linkages more sort of economically motivated? And I think just recently seeing the elections in Tanzania, for instance, the links between Magufuli and the Pentecostal churches there, it's also superbly interesting. So I think I do really, what I've taken away from what I've learned from the two of you today and from is that this is such an amorphous, we really need to study this almost on a church by church basis, or at least country by church. And there's just so much to learn about international and domestic linkages. And I mean, to me, this was a really, this has been an superbly educating hour for me. And I just realized I need to learn so much more. I think there are more questions.
Yeah. Oh, did you have a comment, Elizabeth?
I just wanted to jump in. I agree. This is so wonderful, and Paul Gifford, I have 200 of your books on my shelf, so this is a real honor. On the international question, I 100% agree with you, Lisa. And I, as a foolish graduate student, thought I could try to figure this out, and I went about 1,000 ways to try to find data on this, or look in the archives of the Assemblies of God to see if, in the 50s to the 80s, could we track where they were working, in Africa through their annual reports or something. And it's extremely hard to find out. There's some scholars in the US who study US churches and kind of NGOs and lobbying linkages, and they've collected data through surveys to lots of different civil society organizations, like in Washington, DC, and other churches in the US, to ask about sort of what they do civically. And so I went through their data to see if they talked about international stuff, and it wasn't really, elicited. So yeah, it's a big open question that doctoral students or others I think could really usefully research, but it's a challenge.
Yeah. So we have 2 more questions before we wrap up. We're a little bit over time, but I hope that's fine with everybody. So do you think I think this is for the panelists. Do you think the Pentecostal churches have the capacity to overcome conventional political cleavages lines in Africa? In your own research, do you see any evidence that Pentecostals become involved in partisan politics or align themselves with a specific political party? So one of you.
Paul, go first.
I can say very briefly that yes, this is something we looked at in the Aaron Hurd and I and the article on politics and religion from 2018, and we did find it's a bit of a complicated moment. So this is basically we from 1990 roughly to 2011, there had been one ruling party, the MMD, that had been pretty thoroughly associated with a kind of pro-Pentecostal attitude and policies to varying degrees under different administrations, but pretty consistent. And in 2011, a different party kind of narrowly won the election, was more popularly associated with the leader's, Catholicism, although the Catholic Church was not 100% sort of behind him. But anyway, we did this survey in that moment when the question was, how strong has the party attachment been for Pentecostals who, up until 2 years ago, when we did the study in 2013, up until 2011, it would have been really obvious and expected that they all would have essentially supported the MMD. But now that the MMD sort of isn't in power anymore, and there has been this sort of, constant cry of, oh, Pentecostals, we have to support the government of the day. Our job is to pray for their success, et cetera. Have they kind of switched and started to support the new ruling party, or did these party attachments linger? And we find that the party attachments lingered, that they, in this particular case, Pentecostals in different parts of the country, rural and urban, did still express attachment to the MMD, the sort of more pro-Pentecostal party that was at that time out of office. This is one, small piece of data, and it doesn't mean that this is true all the time or everywhere, but it's something we don't have a lot of data on, so that's probably the best answer I can offer.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so we have Paul, did you have something you wanted to say as well on that question?
Just to say about this bridging cleavages, we haven't mentioned the Islamic factor, which is a point in many countries, and that could be a problem in the future. Again, the mainline churches and the Catholics have a theology of ecumenism, and even other religions. So they are probably, by their theology, less likely to denounce others as satanic. But the Pentecostal churches don't do this. However, having said that, I must say one point to make on this is that, of course, in a little church, say in Kibera, they have to use a local language because they don't speak English. But the model, the paradigm are these big churches where English really is the language, which does tend to break down ethnic tensions. If people are there together, this is not an ethnic church because you have to speak English. So that's another factor to be thrown in. Just on Lisa's point about the international links of Pentecostals, it is important, and a really big pastor can be invited to conferences in the United States and in Sweden and speak there. And of course, this benefits everybody. The Americans can claim, look, this is an international movement, and the local man can say, look, I'm so important that I'm invited overseas to speak.
Oh, sorry, I think we lost you a little bit there. Can you hear us, Paul? Okay, so he warned us this might happen. He's in Ethiopia and the internet is quite unstable, but hopefully he'll come back. I think we'll go on to the last question we have today. Can Can I get it up again? Sorry. So it's probably for you, Elizabeth, now. As Pentecostal churches become more established, do you think that their involvement in political public affairs will increase to the same levels as mainstream churches?
Is Paul, are you back?
Yeah, okay, Paul's back. Yay!
You just need to unmute.
Yeah,
Mm.
Can you see the unmute button on the left corner, I think?
Yeah, bottom left.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, then you can continue. Sorry, I thought we lost you for good.
No,
Yeah,
that's all I had to say. But
Okay.
to me, I don't think the international links of the Pentecostal churches, even the word Pentecostal churches like the Assemblies of God in Africa, and the Apostolic Faith Mission and so on, I think they've been totally surpassed by these newer churches, and even the traditional Apostolic Faith Mission. I remember asking a pastor in Zimbabwe we lived near. He started preaching the gospel of prosperity. And I said to him, why do you do this? This is not part of your tradition. And he replied, well, if I don't preach this, they all leave and will go to Rhema, this American church just starting. So anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. So I think I'll just take that last question one more time so you can hear it as well, Paul. As Pentecostal churches become more established, do you think that their involvement in political public affairs will increase to the same levels as mainstream churches? I think I started asking you, Elizabeth, but you also had a response, Lisa, afterwards.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Oh, yeah.
No, I was just thinking, so my response would basically it would be good that I start so you can correct me. But it seems to me that especially because the way I learned from you, the Pentecostal churches are much more amorphous and they were like much more sort of individualized, and they don't have the kind of an international structure and an international sort of learning order, and they don't. And so my sense is that I don't really see where that sort of very strong linkage would come from. I could see strong linkage between some churches and some, global churches that, like the links that you described between the US and but I don't really see this sort of strong kind of almost hierarchical international order emerging, but just because they are so individualized. But that would be my hypothesis. So, but I should be proven wrong by the experts now.
I agree. Paul, did you want to speak to that?
No, that would be my impression too, that they don't have the structures, but nor do they, at least at the moment, have the theology. So I don't think, at least in my lifetime, I don't think these Pentecostal churches will rise to the level of political involvement that the Catholics and the World Council of Churches do.
I agree with everything that you all just said, and one thing that I would add, maybe now I'm going to need to be corrected by Lisa, but about sort of democratization, thinking more broadly about sort of the political zeitgeist of our moment and of the next few decades. I think in the 90s, the phenomena of political and economic liberalization were massively important. They went to varying degrees. They went hand in hand, and the idea that democratization would involve, as Paul said earlier, kind of the promotion of a more kind of liberal capitalism and multi-party, electoral politics was like the important set of questions of the day, sort of how would this happen and how was this happening and who was doing what. And I think, unfortunately, what we see today in so many parts of the world is that the kind of procedural aspects of electoral democracy, electoral multi-party politics, not necessarily like deep democracy, are often maintained while at the same time, as Lisa was, emphasized early on in this talk, rights are rolled back, and there's a kind of, decoupling of even greater economic inequality and joblessness and the youth bulge, and all of these kind of concerns that are coming up now that weren't really on the table in the early to mid 1990s, when there was more optimism about this sort of double transformation that was going to happen. and so it's in that light that I think when we think about the political roles of the Pentecostal churches, I think, you know, it's again this more focus on sort of the dampening role of that leaders, sort of occasional individual leaders of individual church networks or churches are able to play at the national level, where they legitimate anti-democratic reform, where they direct people's attention away from, as Chiluba did in the mid-90s in Zambia, away from his constitutional amendment that, you know, constrained opposition politicians before an election, and towards his constitutional amendment that, made Christianity the law, the national religion. They have this power to sort of focus people's attention through the media as well as through their own churches, and to legitimate individual politicians. And I think that's where we probably want to keep our eye out. And then also on the demographic change, if they continue to draw, many members from the older churches, it matters less when the older churches call for mobilization for a Democratic Party or whatever. So let's make it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Do we have any last comments before we wrap up? No, I'll
leave it at that. Yes.
And I just want to say that I thought I very much agreed with your analysis. Very, very interesting.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was really good. I think we learned a lot today.
We did.
I have a lot. I have to start writing everything down, I think. And thank you so much for contributing and being so, cool about this. And thank you to our audience for your very good questions today as well, and for your patience, because we went 11 minutes over, but I hope you'll be fine by that. Thank you so much to Professor Elizabeth Sperber and Paul Gifford and Lise Rakner, and hope you enjoyed our seminar.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.